Have you ever thought, are you going to live in Malaysia one day?
The Joshtantap Show.
Today, we're going to talk about retiring in Malaysia. There's so much news coming out right now about property prices in Singapore. I guess you're also worried about it. And also some negative news on what's going on in some projects in Malaysia. Today, we have Gerald on with us.
Hey guys.
Hey, Gerald, I saw some very interesting findings. It mentions that, for an American to consider retirement in Southeast Asia, Singapore is 1 million plus in total cost needed, but Malaysia is only a quarter of that, clocking in at 288,000 estimated amount you need to retire in US dollars in Malaysia. That equates to about 350,000. What do you think of that finding?
I think it's accurate because Singapore is it's expensive, man. Property and cars just takes up most of your money in Singapore.
But cars are optional, right? We have good transport system, unlike in JB even.
Yeah, but one thing to factor is Americans, I believe they have more of a drinking culture than Singaporeans. Yeah, drinking in Singapore is really expensive too.
Alcohol tax, right? You mean alcohol and tobacco tax. Every year budget, there seems to be more taxes on these kind of vices. What are your first thoughts? If you're someone with 350,000, you couldn't save up to $1 million for whatever reason is, then would you really consider, retiring in Malaysia? Because the living costs might be way lower, what?
So my wife's a Malaysian, right? Her family, it's all in Malaysia. Half of them is in KL, the other half is in Kuching, East Malaysia. So yeah, I've been to both places very often. In fact, we go there on 2 weeks stay over almost every quarter. And it's really that cheap. What they say, life's good. Healthcare is cheap. I went for dental once, it was RM1.
Even as a foreigner?
Because my wife's Malaysian. And they allow me to just went in for $1. I don't know if it's just because they didn't check or they don't care.
So it's subsidized, right, by like state medical benefits, yes. What you're saying.
If I have 350,000, right, definitely wouldn't mind Malaysia at all. So for me and my wife, right, we would spend approximately 3,000 ringgit a month, just two of us.
Would that cover enough of, because you didn't buy a car, correct? Like if you were to really retire, would someone need to prepare a bit more? Like buy house there, buy car there, buy insurance there, kind of thing?
So actually, I found this article from Dollars and Cents, which talks about the retirement cost in Malaysia. So I think like, for example, KL, they state that for household, right? I think I'm assuming like for a family of 4, it's 6.9k ringgit. And Selangor is 5.8. So one thing to note is that it's like the Orchard Road of Malaysia. So the state around KL, which a lot of Singapore actually also call KL, right? It's called Selangor. So over there, it's actually a lot more affordable at 5.8k. And the thing about KL is that there's a lot of traffic jams there. So given a choice, I would prefer to stay in Selangor, which is just beside KL. In fact, it surrounds KL.
Are the best schools in KL city center, best hospitals in KL city center, or you can possibly retire well with, I don't know, facilities outside of KL also?
Hey, I'm not very sure. But definitely, Selangor is very comfortable to retire. In fact, most Malaysians, they would stay in Selangor, then travel to KL to work.
Hey, but most people would be thinking of JB instead of KL. Right? KL is like a 4-hour drive. I guess Singaporeans imagine living in JB instead.
If you look at the data from Dollars and Cents, right, JB, it's actually 4.8k. It's a lot cheaper than KL or Selangor, which is what surprised me, right? I would think that actually JB near the custom that area, actually prices are really expensive. But I think what they meant is that on average, because if you go further out in JB, because JB is also quite large, it gets a lot cheaper over there. In terms of quality of life, right, KL is definitely a lot more lively. So over there, I had fun experiences. Like I went to play like badminton in the dark, the first ever, and they have very interesting sites, like, the hills, the mountains. So there's a lot more commercial activity and it feels a lot more like Singapore, where it's very developed, whereas Johor, a lot of it is quite still quite old. It's more of a small town, similar to Kuching, right?
And I think if someone stays in Johor, maybe coming back to Singapore to work is a lot more possible. Just in case in retirement you have some, I don't know, consulting work, or you want to just swing by Singapore a bit more, then that convenience of being very near, just a causeway away, has that appeal factor. But I hear also that, Johor is cheaper than KL. Why not consider Johor as an alternative also, rather than living in KL itself?
I agree with you. In fact, if you want to stay in Malaysia, one of the biggest issues is getting a visa, right? If you don't have the proper visa, then you can only stay for 30 days and one go. Yeah, so if you're in JB, it's easy to come back to Singapore. Then after they go back, to renew that visa. Whereas if you're in KL, wow, it's almost 6 hour journey. If you take a bus, it's 12 hours just to refresh the visa, right? Unless you have enough money to get the retirement visa in Malaysia.
Oh, you're mentioning about the MM2H idea.
Correct.
In any case, anyone viewing this haven't heard of it before, MM2H is like a retirement visa, whereby if you qualify, if not a million ringgit parked in a fixed deposit, and then you still have to have income proof, 40,000 ringgit, which is about 13,000 Sing, then you can qualify for that retirement visa that you can, stay in Malaysia for long term. Hey, but there's also one that's for Sarawak, which you are a bit more familiar with.
Yeah. Do you know about the numbers for Sarawak compared to like general Malaysia?
Definitely much less, and I think less popular also, because most Singaporeans haven't visited East Malaysia, including myself.
Ah, okay. My family is there. Happy to bring you there someday. So I think one of the toughest part of the general MM2H that you need 40,000 ringgit in monthly income that is not inclusive of dividends. You need to be like from a company that pays you the amount in order to qualify. Whereas
Active income, what you're saying.
yeah, it's active income, right? So the company needs to pay you.
That means you must be
almost
working. It's not passive income sources.
Yes, for Sarawak, the number goes down to 10,000 ringgit, which is a lot more reasonable if compared to, say, 40,000 ringgit a month.
4 times less. That's a much lower hurdle for qualifying.
Yes, the pace of living in Sarawak is a lot slower. And over there is quite a fair bit of indigenous people, something that Singaporeans will never hear of,
Then when we think about retirement, it's firstly visa part and convenience to Singapore. Sarawak, and you fly 3 hours, something like that, to Singapore. And there's also living costs, which includes your cars, your alcohol that you want, as well as medical costs. I actually saw this research, and what they actually mentioned is that they rate Malaysia's medical standards close to Singapore on an index. The index, of course, factors in a lot of things, includes the skill, includes the modernization of the treatment, and of course includes the cost. But I fully disagree with that. I think it's quite crappy. It's like satisfaction with cost to you. Of course, Singapore is more expensive. But when it comes to real medical needs, you want problems to be solved. Right? You cannot be penalizing Singapore medical standards because it's expensive. If not, a lot of rich folks wouldn't be flying to Singapore instead for medical tourism. In terms of modernization of their equipment, right? Singapore's cost much higher. I also have that gut feeling that Malaysia might be a bit more dated in their medical practice. Any idea about this topic of medical needs if you were to retire in Malaysia?
In my case, I have the unfortunate experience of having multiple family members go through surgeries in different parts. So for me in Singapore, for my sister-in-law in KL, and my grandma, which is last week in Kuching, right, in Sarawak. Yeah, then I have the three experience to compare. Singapore is fast. So like for example, if I want to go for my surgery, the waiting time, I just wait straight away. I was in 5 minutes, they would rush me to the theater and I'm done. Close my eyes, wake up. Whereas for KL, it's actually really good too. In KL, based on my sister-in-law, she felt that it's actually very efficient, very smooth, and it's cheap. Like anywhere from 1 ringgit to as much as 100 ringgit for the entire operation. Whereas for me, I just did like a simple shoulder surgery that cost me $11,000 Sing dollars
in Singapore.
And
SGH.
correct. Yes, that's after all the subsidies lah. Otherwise you'll be like 25, right?
So there's no subsidy from government, if I hear you accurately, whether it's East or West Malaysia.
Yeah. But the issue there is that there's overcrowding, and for East Malaysia, the healthcare is a lot slower. So we had several bad experience. Like they made her staff. They say, "Oh, you're going to go to surgery tomorrow." They made her staff for 8 hours, and then say, "Oh, sorry, I'll go for surgery." Yeah, sorry, fasting, right? So then they couldn't send her to the theater. Brought her back out. Then the next day say, "Oh, you need to go for surgery." Staff, sorry, faster for another 8 hours. Then tell her, "Sorry, you cannot go for surgery." So there's a lot of miscom. And wow, the whole family rushed down thinking that, surgery happening, then not happening. Then rush down again, happening, then not happening. So that was our experience. It was really, really terrible.
Are you saying the competence level is a bit dubious? I mean, just to put it.
Correct. So that was for our experience in East Malaysia, right? But KL didn't hear of that problem, and Singapore, you never hear of such a problem. So at least I would think that doesn't happen in Singapore lah.
I think in Singapore, we are more fixated on whether it's government or private hospital. Some people complain government is still slow because, private side is definitely better service. That's what you pay for. But then that also boils down to point, if you have a house in JB, then if you need medical needs, just come back to Singapore, treat it. Would that solve everything? Would that be best of both worlds? You drink alcohol in JB, and then when you need medical needs, come back.
But
Would that be crazy or not?
No, actually, I think, right, it might be even better. Like, I feel that what's a lot more value for money is you have insurance to have private hospitals in Malaysia, because private hospitals in Malaysia are not too poor, in my humble opinion.
The
So as long
quality
as
wise of
you,
service.
yeah, if you do
That's your
like
guess.
a lot research, it makes a lot more sense, especially when you have like chronic illnesses, right, that will last for months. Coming to Singapore is very, very expensive. And for those of you who kind of had experience, you can leave a comment below to tell us how much you spend on medical treatment in Singapore, right?
Because as Singaporeans, there are subsidies, right? If you go to subsidized wards, it could really become cheap also. But when you're in Malaysia, then you're a foreigner rate. You're on the chopping block, that's my guess.
Then now this question becomes, would you rather Singapore government hospital or Malaysia private hospital, right? Then that's quite interesting now. Now I'm not very sure.
A private hospital in Malaysia sounds a lot more atas. Hopefully the speed is faster. But again, we don't know the skill level. And what I've put in that survey, right, is that the equipment, the treatment modernization is rated inferior. So I still guess that Singapore hospitals, whether it's government or not, are still going to be pretty good in that standard one.
I'm not very sure. I don't know. I'm conflicted on this. I would love to know what the audience thinks.
So for you, would you buy a property in Malaysia? Because recently there has been some hoo-ha, some Chinese lady, if I'm not wrong, she actually bought a flat in Forest City. I don't know if you've seen the article. And then when she went there, she was sorely disappointed. What she was promised was, beach view, unblocked view, good facilities. And when she went there, horror, because nothing is maintained. Maybe COVID did a part. But what are your first thoughts when you read about the viral article on Mothership?
The first thing I thought of is that she bought from a lousy developer, I think.
Hey,
Not
that's
so
a
like,
renowned Chinese
competent developer.
developer.
Okay, the thing is, I also have personal experience buying property because we were just shopping for properties just, I think, 3 or 4 months ago. I talked about it on my YouTube channel, and it's quite interesting how different the property scene in Malaysia is compared to Singapore. Like Singapore, right? You can be certain that you buy any property in Singapore, it's quite okay, There's certain like regulations, and that you'll be crowded and people will be in, like, fail safe. But in Malaysia, there are a lot of properties that you buy, you really lose money. Like, you lose a lot of money in Malaysia. And I think in part because there's an oversupply of property and the regulation there is a lot more lax, right? So developers are not very
You cut corners, right? What you're thinking
cut
of?
corners. Yeah. So I think the Forest City one, or previously, I think a lot of people call it the Iskandar ghost town, right? Now they call it the Forest City ghost town, is one prime example of people who don't know what they're buying, right? So they just bought because, hey, they went to the sales gallery, and I went to the sales gallery myself as well. Wow, they really they choreographed the sales experience. Wow, serenade you, koyo until you feel, wow, this place like so beautiful. Got water fountain, right in front of the mountain, top story unblocked view. Then after that, tell you to buy some more $0 down payment, and then your rental can cover your property payment. You literally take a bank loan, and then you earn passive
$0
income.
down payment.
Correct. You don't need. Okay, so you don't need, because it's a $0 no cash outlay kind of. You can take bank loan for the entire property, right? Then they calculate for you the numbers. Wow, your rental can cover the monthly installment. Why are you thinking about? Why are you still waiting?
Any idea what's the loan requirement in Malaysia? Or how come it's different from Singapore in that $0 down payment part?
Actually, it's not $0, but because there's this trick of the trade in Malaysia where they do like cashback. So because Singaporeans, if you want to buy a property in Malaysia, it needs to be over $1 million ringgit lah. And that number sounds very scary, right? But in actuality, right, a lot of properties there are over the $1 million mark. And what happens is that developers will kind of inflate the price, and then they will give you a cashback. For example, I charge you $1 million for the property. After you buy it, I give you a $200,000 cashback.
Then that's where you use it for the down payment. Something like that. Above board or not.
Yeah, so I took an 80% bank loan, for example. I can't remember what was the bank loan my family took, right? So 80%, for example. Then that's 800K, right? But hey, you got 200K cash. So You know, so that's how
Anyone
the
viewing Singapore not allowed such practices.
yeah.
But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised actually lah. And if you're viewing this and you have heard of stories on how they can structure creatively above board
Yes.
or underboard, and leave the comment sections. I think it'll be interesting to discuss. But the
Yeah,
main
so
thing
they
is right now
usually
it's a
go
ghost
you.
town. What? Like even
Yes.
if you bought it, who's going to live there? Like all the talk of rental people. Maybe some Singaporeans are living there with rental costs so expensive now. But before that, I think it's totally empty there.
Unlike Singapore, right, Malaysia is very big. So if you buy an area that is not accessible, that the people of because Malaysians would know where the work areas are, where the nice roads are. But as a foreigner, you don't know all these intricacies of transportation. How is it like to work there? So if you just anyhow buy a random property, right, you really don't know whether people want to rent the place or not.
I think I've heard before that Grab drivers are reluctant to go into Forest City or GrabFood riders because it's just so far and you don't know when is the next deal coming.
So that's why when you have a whole bunch of people like buying a whole a property, right, and nobody is renting it because all of these are investors, they just want to rent out. So you can imagine the competition to rent out the property as well as the prices in which sellers who want to sell out would sell at. So there's a lot of oversupply basically.
So there's not much local demand, which means also if investors are not around there for vacation home or just not renting it out successfully, then that's where it leads to that poor occupancy. There's also some reports that it's slowly reviving. I'm a bit skeptical, or maybe it's just temporary because Singapore's rent is just so expensive. But I also don't rate it too highly. Because recently I went to Putri Harbour for vacation. Putri Harbour is quite near Forest City. Then from what I can see in Putri Harbour also is poor maintenance. There was actually a theme park there, Thomas Land, previously, 3-4 years ago. And it actually closed shop. So even in Putri Harbour, where it was meant to be something harbourfront, something, like Keppel kind of a look, the maintenance suggests that, you can't really trust them. That's the gut feeling I get in Malaysia developments.
So I think that's the key lesson, right? And when you want to look at Malaysia properties, really look for developers or areas that you can trust, because a lot of places you really, really can't trust when they promise you A, B, C, D, right? You really don't know what you'll be getting.
Which means maybe better to buy a resale, right? Then at least you can see the neighborhood. You can see the upkeep. I think that would make sense rather than you buy a project off the paper.
And this is where we talk about other horror stories, because when my family was buying, they asked, hey, Jero, ask for some tips, right? Then I went to do some research. Apparently, even buying resale doesn't free you up from all the horror stories in Malaysia. You really need to understand the ground. So here are some other horror stories that we kind of found out when trying to look for a Malaysian property in Selangor area. Unlike Singapore, where our terrain is quite simple, straightforward, in Malaysia, right, there's a lot of mountainous areas or small hills, right? So there is actually a lot of places, because the build quality is poor, right? They're actually susceptible to natural disasters. So one example would be landslide. So if you look for properties that are undervalued, right, it could be because they have experienced natural disasters before. And that is because not just the fact that there's natural disasters, but also the foundation of the property was quite bad. So then there will be like potholes, like maybe every 2 or 4 years, there'll be one big pothole because the landslide happened and it just broke the road. And then one big hole there. So that's why the property is cheap. And then there is also a lot of cases of poor build quality. So poor build quality could be the way they built the property, right? They didn't really think through how it's done. So like typically when you build a property, there is like an integrated development, right? In Singapore, you always have a nice condo, then there's the park, then there is amenities, car park. Yeah, so one of the things are not built, like you have a huge ass multi-story car park, but a huge condo, but there's no car park. Or for example, they build halfway, then the developer just abandoned the project and say, oh, no money, I stop building. So even though you bought a completed property, thinking that all the other things are going to be built, right? Suddenly it just gets abandoned, and you see like you live in the middle of a construction zone, abandoned construction zone. So that actually happens before. So that's the issue or challenge in investing in Malaysia property.
Hearing all this horror story, I think my own quick conclusion is, if I would like to stay in Malaysia for retirement, maybe I'll rent for a few years even. I don't have intention to stay there, but maybe rent for a long while. Then you can really see all these negative factors surfacing. Then maybe it's time to buy if you really have seen the worst of the place and you are comfortable with it, and then maybe you can really buy and get yourself deep into that living status. If not, you're much better off not being tied down to a home. What are
Yeah,
your
that's
final
a
thoughts on
brilliant
that?
idea.
Rent it first 2 years, you see, you test, got landslide come, you already know already, right? Or if everything is correct, then you commit to buying. And then it's like dating first before getting married.
Yeah, that's true. That's actually very, very true. In fact, over there, rental yields are a lot lower for investors, I think, for the most part. So as a renter, you actually benefit from vis-a-vis cheaper more value, right? So then it's good to rent and speak to the local people about where are good places, hotspots, to kind of understand what they think about the place.
Yeah, then finally settle down on somewhere. Well, I think this is a good chat. This is a good chat. So as always, when you're watching this, if you have experience, share with us. We're all curious. How does retirement in Malaysia look like? How does buying a home there really feel like? And as always, Gerald, thank you for joining in this discussion. We'll see you in the next episode. Take care as always.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
Take care. Have you?